Hi, my name is Naomi Rosenfeld, and I'm the Executive Director of the Atlantic Jewish Council. We represent the organized Jewish communities of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland. For the past 4 years, with our national partner, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, we have been a proud partner and supporter of Halifax Pride, marching every year in the Halifax Pride Parade and through our series of Halifax Pride Shabbat dinners, which last year was hosted at Halifax City Hall with Mayor Mike Savage. This year, because of COVID-19, we have decided to present a virtual speaker. Therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce Justin Tobin, an Atlantic Canadian who identifies as both Jewish and Indigenous. Justin is a folklore undergraduate student at Memorial University in Newfoundland. Originally from Bishop Falls, Newfoundland, Justin grew up in a largely secular and assimilated world from both aspects of his identity. By the time Justin finished high school and moved to St. John's, he was able to connect with both the Jewish community and the urban Indigenous community. Through these communities, Justin found his voice and his love of activism. Between studies, Justin strives to advocate within the Mi'kmaq, Jewish, and LGBTQ+ worlds. Identifying as a gay, two-spirited, observant Jewish man, Justin's activism largely focuses on anti-Semitism and cultural restoration for both the Jewish and Indigenous world. Therefore, please join me in welcoming our speaker, Justin Tobin.
A lot of people don't necessarily know about people that exist at the intersection that you exist in.
Yeah,
How does that feel?
For me, I never had to choose between being Jewish and being Indigenous because it's something that I am. And I am both. I'm part of both tribes, ethnically, culturally. I actually heavily buy into the idea of being two-spirited. I do think that everyone has a soul, or at least most people, I hope. But whenever I meet someone, they are always like, you're the first Jewish person I ever met, or wow, I don't know too many Native people anymore, which is wild because Newfoundland has the highest amount of Mi'kmaq First Nations people in Atlantic Canada. So like, it is really common. It's just like growing up in a really Eurocentric society does a lot. It's really wild because in my lifetime, the bullying and the animosity that I faced growing up is generational, not only on my Indigenous side, but also my Jewish side. Both of them. And they work together to create a beautiful tapestry that is me, but they also work to create a beautiful identity crisis, really. Are you sure you look pretty white? Or they'll be like, oh my God, I love cowboy and Indian movies. You don't look Jewish. You're really handsome. You're not one of those Jews, are you? Like, how Jewish are you? I hear it all the time. And I'm like, oh my God, you shouldn't have just said that. And I grew up wanting to be like everyone else, wanting to be just white. And that is largely, what my mother grew up wanting to be. I am the only one of my cousins that still is involved in Indigenous circles. I'm the only one of my cousins that became involved in Jewish circles. It wasn't easy for her. Her father he's passed now. I loved him so much. My grandfather, he was called a jacquetar or a jacquetar. This comes from the French word jacquetier. When early Indigenous people traded with Europeans, they didn't have the same clothing styles. It was much more common to use natural materials like moose hide, sealskin, these types of things. So once trading began with Europeans, it was really common to trade large amounts of cheap industrial cloth Indigenous people often almost always overpaid for this cloth. They wouldn't know how to work with it, wouldn't know, because they had never worked with the texture before. So it was very common to wear this, almost like when you wear a blanket and then you put your arms halfway through and you wear it like that, and you would tie a belt around. And these people, these Indigenous people, would be known as jaquetiers to the French, which ultimately became jacketars or jacketar. So it was another like slur for being Indigenous, and my mom would get that, and she would get called, a Hebrew, or they would make Second World War jokes. So I really think it's those traumas that kind of, pushed her to say like, okay, I'm really going to try to fit into my community, and my kids are going to fit in. And it's not just her, her siblings. She only has sisters, 2 other sisters, and they are of the same mindset. But it was very sweet, because once I started getting back involved, some of my cousins started taking part, more so in the Jewish side. Though it's the same, it's both from my mother. So my first cousins are as well, both Indigenous and Jewish, just like me.
And then in addition to inhabiting 2 kind of very different and yet similar spaces, and 2 spaces that occupy a lot in terms of emotional labor to explain to other people, being Jewish and being Mi'kmaq, add in the fact that you're someone who identifies as queer to the mix.
It's amazing now. When I was growing up, I often would think to myself that I was the last dinosaur alive. I don't know any Jewish people besides my family. I did know some other mixed kids, because that is pretty common throughout Newfoundland. But coming out as queer, gay, two-spirit, to me, they're synonymous. It has really helped my Jewish identity, as well as helped me grow as a person. In almost every Indigenous culture, you'll find the equivalent of two-spirit. Two-spirited people are often looked at that they, depends on the group. Some people think they have a masculine soul and a feminine soul. Some people think it is just 2 souls. Every First Nations and Inuit culture has their beliefs. So I can only really speak to what I know, which is kind of like pan-Indigenous as well as like Mi'kmaq teachings. The idea of 2 spirits was very important to the Mi'kmaq. We were the center of all life. We were upheld in the community and considered sacred. That is becoming so again, but for the last few hundred years, the Mi'kmaq people openly embraced Christianity for the most part. That's due to Mi'kmaq folklore, being keepers of the Eastern Door, folklore that speaks of white men with blue eyes crossing the sea to meet. Thus, when contact did happen in 1497, Christianity was largely accepted within Mi'kmaq spheres, and that really changed the face of what it means to be two-spirit in Mi'kmaq identity today. I found it really important for the reinstitution of the importance of two-spirited people. Having 2 souls, I feel such a connection and such a strong love and pull towards Judaism. I love going to service. I love leading service. I love taking part in my community. I love going to Israel. I feel such a connection and a pull to that land that only a Jew could describe. And I'm sure you felt it before too, Jess. But that being said, where the whole 2-spirit or 2-souled comes into play, I feel the exact same thing when I'm on the land here. I feel it's hard to describe when you feel your ancestors and everything around you, but the idea that I go fishing, I enjoy the same nature that my family has for at least 10,000 years or more is beautiful to me. Because of that, sometimes do I feel like I'm kind of like a semi-Jew or a demi-Jew? The thoughts cross my mind, but at the end of the day, sometimes you're like me and you eat rabbit stew for Shabbat. We're all doing it in our, own way and our own capacity, and there's not many like my family, but that makes us all the more special.
I love the way you described the connection to the land, because when I talk about going home to people, I cry every time my plane touches down in Israel. And you think I would cry when I leave, but the amount of spirituality you feel for me upon ascending, every time I make Aliyah or every time I go, I cry. Every single time.
Step foot on the ground, and it just feels so right. And it's funny because I never anticipated that, especially growing up where I did. I guess I always kind of had that feeling. My grandfather would take me on nature walks. So my father's fully white, Newfie dude, really cool. And my mom, her father is Indigenous, or was Indigenous. He's passed now. And my grandmother's Jewish.
May his memory be for a blessing.
Zichanam livrecha. He would take me for walks throughout nature. He would show me as much as he knew about the plants, and that was so important for me to instill a sense of belonging and a sense of pride in where you're from. And I never understood, because I don't have the same amount of patriotism on a nationalistic level. I also like to recognize the past and what has happened in the past and what continues to happen today. But I know that when it comes to my country, there's Israel and then there's the land. And the land is the daughter of God and the source of all protection we have in North America.
I love that you talk about Be'aret, about being in the land, both in Newfoundland and in Canada, as well as in Israel. What cultural or spiritual practices, or what kind of space within Judaism or your Indigenous heritage do you feel overlap or intersect?
I feel actually a lot of practices are different in person, but the idea of sending gratitude to God, to Hashem, to Creator. There's so many words for the exact same thing. So many people use sacred fires. So many people have prayers and songs that mean so much. For me, my ideal Shabbat, and for those that don't know what Shabbat is the Jewish Sabbath, the equivalent of Christian Sundays, though ours is the OG. We celebrate it from Friday evening to Saturday evening, so sundown to sundown. I love to kick off Shabbat in the summertime with a bonfire, which here we call a boil up if there's food, because it's usually by an ocean. I love to burn medicines, sweetgrass, sage, tobacco. I like to think of the bonfire as my Shabbat candle. Do I keep adding wood to it? Yes. Is it the most shomer? No. But does it make sense for me, and does it put my spirituality together? 100%. I love being able to do like a Shabbat with nature. Me and my partner, we have special pairs of moccasins just for Shabbat, so we know we have to relax because we don't want to scuff up these moccasins, and we call them our Shabbaccasins. I love my Shabbaccasins. Usually I'm lighting the candles. I'll light the medicine first and the candles last. I will try to abstain from continuing to light fire, which can be a Jewish commandment, though sometimes it can be unavoidable for me, and that's it. I'll arm wrestle God when I have to, if I have to. When I do Havdalah on Saturday nights, then I as well love to have a long braid of sweetgrass and just kind of be passing that around the circle. I find it's often the little things. Like for Passover, the wine you're supposed to drink is supposed to be kosher L'Pesach. I live in Newfoundland. You can barely find kosher things, let alone kosher L'Pesach. You can't get it. I've tried. I've looked. Instead, when I need a substitute for those kinds of things, because I genuinely think if I try and it's just no way possible for me, then there is no way that my religion would want me to be held back, to uh, be detrimented by the fact that I live in a more isolated or non-Jewish area. When at the same time, I see that as a time to shine for my Indigenous side. So if I can't find any kosher L'Pesach wine, instead I am getting a nice fruit wine with berries that my ancestors have been eating and making drinks with from time immemorial. I love a good cloudberry wine. And to me, that's special because even though it's not kosher L'Pesach, it's kosher L'Mi'kmaq, and that's good enough for me.
That is so special. I remember being in Guatemala doing a Havdalah with like a lychee juice and two candles that I got from a hostel in, La Guatitlan in Guatemala. And there was a Chabad nearby, but they were Shomer Shabbos, and I hadn't gone during Shabbat to get anything. And I did Havdalah, and I thought, this is good.
So, like, if I didn't get around to baking challah this week, or I didn't put an order in at one of the bakeries, because bakeries do make challah here. Actually, there's some really tasty spots to get it, but sometimes it slips my mind, and I've totally done it with, you name it, Ritz crackers, vegetable thins, bannock. Yeah, I actually made like challah bannock, so I added lots of eggs to it, and it was really good. Challah bannock is like one of the culminations of who I am in a food.
So it sounds like there's such a beautiful celebration of, you do what you can with where you are. And I think God thinks that's amazing. And the fact that you're trying and that you're making such a big effort. You are so involved in your Jewish space now. What does your involvement look like in Indigenous spaces in Newfoundland? What does that space look like? What spaces are you involved in?
So I remember you mentioned you were going to do the Cabot Trail in your personal time. So Cabot is actually thought to have landed. It was later proposed and is largely accepted that Cabot had landed in Newfoundland first. Newfoundland has had contact between Beothuk, otherwise known as Beothuk, Mi'kmaq. We've had contact with Europeans since the 1200s. When Leif Erikson came, lived very briefly in northern Newfoundland at a place now known as Lansom Meadows. And then again in 1497, because it has been over 500 years of at first just, a fishing colony here, a fishing colony there. Suddenly a chunk of this island now belongs to the Europeans. Now it's all of it. Okay, now they want us to change our religion. Now we have to go to school differently. Now we have to speak different language. Now we have to do this, and this. And really all of those steps, the declassified guide to assimilation, it ends up with people like me. People whose blood runs the redder, but genes have been paled, in the wise words of Buffy St. Murray. The Beothuk culturally are dead, still live on today through the Mi'kmaq, particularly the Mi'kmaq Mi'kmaq and the Qalipu Mi'kmaq, because there's actually two different Mi'kmaq groups in Newfoundland, which people don't even realize. We don't have our language. We don't have a lot of things anymore. The last native Mi'kmaq speaker died in 86 or 87. Nova Scotia is lucky. Eskazoni, as well as one other community, almost the entire community speaks Mi'kmaq as a first language. And I have friends from there. I've met people from there. I think it is the bee's knees, like the coolest thing. And it's something that actually this relates to my Jewish identity, because when I am talking in Indigenous circles about language reinstitution and the importance of language to an ethnicity, I almost always bring up Israel. Israel has had different reasons for reinstituting their language. There were so many of us. We all spoke different language, Yiddish here, Latvian here, Lithuanian here, Arabic over there, Turkish over there. It made sense to have a unifying language, which was our ancestral language, Hebrew. It's a little bit different when it comes to Indigenous circles, because oftentimes different Indigenous groups will speak different languages. So I'm Mi'kmaq. My family would speak, if we still spoke it, Mi'kmaq. The Cree people, otherwise known as the Nahaya, they speak Cree. OG Cree is a totally different thing. Then there's, my goodness, Gwich'in, Mohawk. I could keep going and keep going and keep going. So it's a lot. It's kind of like looking at this federal scale that was Israel, and the entire government pushed for Hebrew to be reinstituted as a language. It is going to be harder in North and South America, largely North America, but not impossible. I really think that the federal government of Canada owes it to its Indigenous people to, if they truly are committed to re-indigenizing spaces, I think they owe it to us to help us bring our languages back. Now I'll hear critique on this, and people will say, oh, well, just speak English. English is so easy and it's the language of the world. I don't care. I really could care less if English was the most popular language or if English was the least popular language. And I'm saying this as someone who grew up speaking only English. I now speak English, French, some pretty terrible Hebrew, but Mi'kmaq's next on my list. Does anyone speak it on my island? No way. But I'd like to see within my lifetime that change. I know for a fact,
Amen.
Yeah, I hope so, I know for a fact that one day, please God, when I get to adopt children, their first language isn't going to be English. It'll either be Mi'kmaq or Hebrew, because that's who they are. That's what they deserve. My ancestors returned to their earth, returned to their beloved land, and it's not going to be in vain.
I have tears. I have goosebumps.
Thank you. Often you had asked me about my involvement in Indigenous spaces, because we know each other personally, and I'm a pretty big player in the Jewish world in St. John's. And believe it or not, I'm the exact same thing in the Indigenous world. Big player, that sounds a little showboaty, but I am really involved. I am a board member at the Circle of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Youth, which is a resource center at the university for Indigenous students. I'm an active part of the Indigenous Student Resource Center. In the past, I have worked with groups like We Matter to do an ambassadorship program in Newfoundland, all about providing hope for Indigenous youth, providing education and tools to allow them to circumvent a lot of the problems that Indigenous youth face. My friend Jenna Robar, a Mi'kmaq woman from Nova Scotia with roots to Newfoundland, put a call to the federal government, 6, 7, 8 months ago, demanding that, getting signatures and demanding that Indigenous languages in each area be returned to the legal status of an official language. So all documents coming out will have to be in these languages. And I think that is a great idea. Is anyone going to be able to read the Newfoundland Mi'kmaq driver's manual? Not yet. But that's the point. You put it out there and people can learn. People will have the choice. It's so funny because I live in St. John's, which is a pretty white place, but my life fully revolves around Jewish things and Jewish people and Indigenous things and Indigenous people. Those are the two circles that I spin myself in, and I love it. I have a very happy life. I think that you need to take space no matter what. You need to go places, if you are able, that make you uncomfortable, because it is not the ones that are making you uncomfortable that deserve you. When I was in kindergarten, we were told that there was no Indians on the island of Newfoundland. First things first, that was untrue, because most of the specialists in our local hospital were from India. Second, when they were referring to Indigenous people, that was very untrue. We had, even at that point, so that was 2003, Mi'kmaq First Nation Reserve was about an hour and a half from my house, and I grew up in a Mi'kmaq territory community, so I fall under the region that is Halifax First Nation, and Halifax First Nation is a landless group, or a landless First Nation. So it comes with certain drawbacks, especially when it comes to having rights and privileges in terms of the land and hunting and harvesting and these types of things. It's an ongoing issue, but Halibu Mi'kmaq, their region, even though they don't have a land claim, encompasses so many towns. And I grew up in one of those designated Mi'kmaq towns. It's funny because you could drive down the street and there's still only one road that continuously goes. It's called Main Street. I won't leave you hanging. And you could drive down the road when I'm going to one of my grandparents' house or an aunt's house or something like this, or an uncle's house, something like this. And you would be able to, for the most part, know, who's Mi'kmaq, who's this, who's that. But it's not reflected in our education system. I remember being in kindergarten and being told, like our teacher had said, like, there's no Indians in Newfoundland. And being really confused. Like, why do they keep calling us that? That's not who we are. They should know better. I understand, mistakes happen in the 1500s. You confused us for someone else. That's okay. If I had a nickel for every time I sung out to someone that I thought was my friend and then they turned around and it was a different person, I'd be rich. But after 500 years, it's time. Call us by our name. Mi'kmaq are different than Mohawk, which is different than Maliseet. A lot of my quotes are coming from Buffy St. Marie. If you don't know who she is, look her up. She's an Indigenous activist from Piapo or Piapot, I'm not sure how you say it, Saskatchewan. Was adopted by a Mi'kmaq couple with roots to Nova Scotia, but she grew up on a Mi'kmaq reserve in Boston, Massachusetts, where there are some Mi'kmaq people too. Super cool. She's been singing professionally since 1959. I'm seeing her in concert next month. That to me is so important, because the truth of the matter is, all across North America was so important. It was entirely mapped out. Turtle Island had trade routes galore, the Mississippi River being one of them. But what a lot of people don't know is there was pyramids in Illinois and New York State. Pyramids of earth, so it's not the same cut stone like you'd imagine in Egypt or Acapulco or these types of regions. Instead, it's more like a man-made mount. They were often used for burial mounds, so as each generation would pass away, they would go on top, and you'd keep covering it with earth, becoming more and more sacred. Most of these mounds, when really they should be known by what they are, they're pyramids, moved for construction, or they'd be raided by those who would later sell it to what they find to museums. But all of our stories, how in Mi'kmaq have seashells been found from Hawaii, or turquoise from modern day Nevada found, also in, I can't remember if it was New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. Eurocentric education would have us believe that we were uncivilized. savages, that we, didn't know a mountain from an anthill, that we didn't communicate and only warred with each other. Now, the warring thing did happen and is totally did happen. But even in Mi'kmaq, there's a tale of how we learned to play, I can't remember if it's either hockey or lacrosse. I'm not quite sure. One of the two. And this would have been a prototype of hockey. Hockey's thought to have been a European sport. It's interesting that it largely changed face in North America when it merged with games that were already being played here, but that's another discussion. There's this really old story about a person in Mi'kmaq history, and his name was Glooskap, or Kluskap, depending on how you say it. I believe Glooskap is the more correct pronunciation. And he was a really great chief. He was from Unama'ki. Unama'ki is now known as Cape Breton. You can still go to the beach where it's said that he grew up nearby. Glooskap always wore an amethyst necklace, and that was really common to show off your wealth, to show your place in the society, and also for trading. You could take out pieces of your necklace or your bracelet, these types of things, and you could trade with other groups. Someone had stolen his wife and family and whisked them away to another land, and Mi'kmaq people hadn't been there before. This land was known as Labrador. The people there were the Inuit. When Glooskap went to Labrador for his wife, he was challenged to a game of the sport. If he lost, he had, I think, to stay as well as give over his necklace, which, like, a full necklace of amethyst is a big deal. It's much more than a piece or two. He ended up winning, and when the leader, because Inuit people don't have chiefs, but the leader of the region that he was in, when he lost the game, this leader went to take off his Labradorite necklace and give it to Glooskap, which was custom, and he just said, all I want is my family back, and I also am taking this game back with me. This is reflected in education, because if you look for these kinds of stories that this person lived, I know where they were born, I know where they were buried, I know, to go venerate their body kind of thing. But Eurocentric education would put that in the folklore section, or the cultural and anthropology section, never history. Our history is never deemed credible because it was shared peacefully by the grandfathers and grandmothers. And that is at its core violence, because you're telling a people, like, you're not capable of knowing your own history. We are going to write about you. We are going to say things. And it's a very similar experience to what Jews have experienced in Europe, especially over the 1800s and the 1900s, with misinformation and being misrepresented. Though very different, the Jewish people and the Mi'kmaq, for example, I think that there's a lot of lessons that can be learned on both sides with each other, and I really think they could bring out the best in each other.
Did you come out as gay first and Two-Spirit later? Did you ever come out as Two-Spirit? Was coming out a step? Was there any resemblance of coming out in your structure, or was it organic?
So I came out as gay in I came out as bisexual in grade 7. But it was like just before summer holidays. And then in fall of grade 8, I was like, never mind, I'm actually gay. Which was a lot more fitting for me. Now, grade 8 was really young, and I come from a town of about 2,000 people with one road and like 6 or 7 different churches. I had always known about two-spirited people. I remember there being like a poster in my junior high school, in my hometown about it, because there was enough mixed kids. I always thought that it was a term that was reserved for people that had a fuller blood quantum, for people that grew up on a res. for people that were so much more involved with their culture. I just assumed that I was too watered down to use it. It's really only the past few years when I've become more involved in Indigenous circles that I decided, like, you know what, actually this is my work. This was like carved out for me. For me, it makes sense how I feel so comfortable in both ethnic spheres, being Mi'kmaq and being Jewish, how I never have to choose, and I give all that to being two-spirit.
You said, I'm not the only Jewish and Indigenous person. I also have a set of first cousins that are Indigenous and Jewish. If there was something you could say to any Indigenous and Jewish queer youth, because I believe that maybe in 20 years, this is going to be in an archive. Okay, maybe 20 years is too soon. 50 years, this is going to be in an archive, and a young Jewish Indigenous person will be able to, hopefully, God willing, speak Mi'kmaq and speak Hebrew, and we'll be able to look at this and think, wow, what would you say to those people?
Right here, now, today, I think of today as the newest possible rendition of the future. It's hard to imagine what the future is going to be like. But if anyone watching this in the future finds themselves reminiscent or reflective of what I have said, who I am, I want them to know that they really aren't alone. They may feel it, and they will feel it, but the best thing that you could do is being yourself. The best form of rebellion is being who you are and who your ancestors prayed that you would be. What you got to remember is your heart, it's your life. In Mi'kmaq understanding and teaching, there's 7 teachings, 7 grandfather teachings, as well as the 7 generations. And you should remember that there's 7 generations behind you who prayed for you to be alive today. And 7 generations ago, my Indigenous ancestors, they must be really happy because they lived a much more oppressed and compressed life. And my only prayer is that in 7 generations' time, my family is bigger, gayer, more Native, more Jewish than ever thought possible.
Amen, amen. That's everything.